Okay, good to go. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you to those of you who are in person. So we've got a lot of people online who are guests. So for those who don't know me, Sasha Zagloff, I'm a child psychologist here in the department. Really excited to have Rick Hoyle here. Just a quick story for what prompted me to invite Rick. So last year in the psychology internship, we had some really eager interns meet with me to say, you know, Sasha, our faculty are kind of like outdated. What are your thoughts on how to keep everyone up to speed? And I was really grateful for the feedback and also reminded them that like nobody can know everything. And so maybe we can also think about that. To which they said, well, sure, you can't know everything, but people also really talk with a lot of certainty and confidence when they're wrong. And I thought, oh, okay, so that's a completely different issue. So how can we stay up to date, recognize when maybe we don't know things, and remain curious? And then at dinner last night, we had this fascinating conversation about what does it actually mean to tell somebody they're wrong? And how do you know that you're so certain and right when you're giving people feedback that they're wrong? So I'm very excited to have Rick Hoyle here to talk with us about intellectual humility. And so just a little bit about him. Dr. Hoyle is a professor and associate chair in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke, and an affiliated professor in the Department of Psychology and Behavioral Sciences at Aarhus University in Denmark. His research makes use of concepts and methods from social, personality, developmental, and quantitative psychology for the study of self-regulation, health behavior, and well-being, primarily during emerging adulthood. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, a charter fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, and an elected member of the Society for Experimental Social Psychology and the Society of Multivariate Experimental Psychology. So lots of intellectual humility, I'm guessing. Currently, his research is funded by NIDA, NIMH, and the John Templeton Foundation. Welcome.
So here's how I'd like to go about telling you about intellectual humility and the work that I've been doing now for about a decade with various colleagues whose names will appear as we move along. First, I'd like to introduce you to the concept. And I'll just note that it was not a concept that was subject to empirical research a decade ago. It was a subject of theology and philosophy. So part of the journey that I'll kind of talk you through is how do we take it from a rich concept that is defined in ways that work in that setting to a sort of tighter and more operational construct that we can subject to empirical study. I'll put some boundaries on intellectual humility. I think almost any time I have conversations about the concept, it tends to creep a little bit and it becomes more than it really is. And that's not a good way to do science. So I'll sort of put it within the context of a broader set of intellectual virtues, of which it is one. Then I will tell you how we measure it, because essentially every bit of data I will show you hinges on your feelings about how we measure it. And that itself will be something interesting for us to discuss. A big part of my work has been to move the field, this emerging field that studies intellectual humility, from focusing on it as a general trait to thinking about it in what I call specific terms. That is, it's not just how generally intellectually humble I am, but how much humility I hold certain ideas and beliefs with. The understanding being that that can vary from issue to issue. There may be some issues in which I hold humility, I hold high humility, others in which I'm quite unwilling to concede that somebody else may have something to tell me or that I could potentially be wrong. And I'll play that out for you. Then I want to spend a fair bit of time talking about mechanisms. The grant we currently have from the Templeton Foundation is focused specifically on this. The motivation, I think, is that if we ever want to be able to cultivate or change intellectual humility, we need to know what the levers are, right? What's sort of under the hood, so to speak, that we can tinker with that might allow us to move it around. I'll discuss mostly benefits, though I'm a firm believer that nothing is good all the time and always. So there are some liabilities to it. And then lastly, some mostly musings, but some early data on how it might be cultivated. So I sort of begin often when I'm writing about and thinking about this, just to sort of underscore what I think to be the kind of obvious idea that there's almost nothing we can know for sure. That itself is an intellectually humble thing to say, I suppose, but it's real. If you really press people about how they know something, how they can confirm for sure that it's true, they often struggle. And operating within a world in which we can never know entirely for sure that certain things, in some cases that we hold very near and dear, in fact, maybe in fact base our entire identity on them, is for sure. Means we need to learn to live with uncertainty, and how we manage that uncertainty is a lot of what intellectual humility is about. Of course, we all don't handle uncertainty in the same way, and we dig our heels in and we feel certain in ways that are contrary to how other people feel certain about the very same thing. And that leaves us then in this place of having to live together and to think about issues together, potentially in productive ways. And toward the end, I want to introduce a concept that sits alongside intellectual humility that I think gets particularly at this idea. How do we deal with living in a polarized world in which even within our bubble, but certainly if we venture outside our bubbles, we're going to encounter people who disagree with us quite strong. So let me start with the general characteristic of humility, because intellectual humility can be situated within it. And the idea is that to some degree, humility is about how I think about myself in relation to a variety of things. There are a couple of possibilities. I can think more of myself than can be supported empirically. I can think less of myself. And philosophers in particular like to talk about humility broadly, and intellectual humility in particular as kind of right-sizing my understanding of who I am and what I know. Which means, by the way, I can know a lot, and therefore the right size is for me to think highly about myself in certain domains, but there are others in which I know almost nothing, and right-sizing it is to acknowledge that I know almost nothing. So this idea of accuracy is very central to that notion of humility, and then owning those limitations, recognizing they're there and finding comfort with that acknowledgement. The definition broadly includes other things beyond just sort of who I am, what have I done. Same thing, keeping those in perspective, not claiming more than in fact I have really done, but also not perhaps falsely being modest about what I have done either. So that accuracy thing is present here as well. And then there's an interpersonal side to it as well. Who do I care about and for? And this idea of humility is that I'm attentive to others rather than being purely self-focused. So we can then think about this broad construct of humility in very specific terms with respect to a certain set of aspects of experience. We can talk about cultural humility, for example, relational humility, spiritual humility, and in particular, our focus here is going to be knowledge and understanding. That is, how do I sort of right-size my understanding of my own knowledge and understanding, and how do I own limitations such as they are in what I can and do know. So in effect, then, intellectual humility is this notion of having the right size me that doesn't overclaim, but also doesn't undervalue what I actually know. Again, not to suggest that intellectual humility is more than it is. It's useful to sort of put it within the context of a broader set of intellectual virtues. And by the way, we could even think about those of us who are psychological scientists like to think about constructs and what even is a virtue. That's not a term that we tend to use. Philosophers very much like that term. Psychologists, it's not clear entirely what that is if you're thinking mechanistically or process-wise. But nonetheless, intellectual humility sits within this set of intellectual virtues. And I'm showing you here a set that is put forward by actually a school, a high school, that's built entirely around the concept of cultivating intellectual virtue. So everything is purposefully related to how to promote intellectual humility in young adults. So these are the distinctions they make, and these are pretty prototypic and go pretty far back, many of them to Aristotle, for example. In particular, I think intellectual humility bumps into, for example, open-mindedness in ways that I'll show you momentarily. Certainly, we expect it to include a certain amount of curiosity, but it's different in important ways. Certainly critical thinking, we would imagine a person who's intellectually humble, who understands they don't know everything there is to know, might also be motivated to know more, and therefore we might expect critical thinking. And situated in this last category, the virtues of self-growth, is intellectual humility. So here's how we define it, and I can tell you that this definition reflects hours of debate between a group of 4 philosophers and 4 psychological scientists who had been tasked by the Templeton Foundation to make this construct such that it can be studied, that it can be measured, and it can be observed, it can be scaled. And this is the definition that we came up with. You can see that it's framed as a general tendency. So at that point, we were thinking very strongly that this is an individual difference, that some people reflect more than other people. Not all individual differences are traits necessarily, but I think there was a general feeling that it might be something like a trait. So just highlighting the key pieces of this definition, accepting the fallibility of our personal understanding and views. That's that owning of limitations, that what I think to be true may in fact not be, because I'm not equipped to fully understand many things that I want to know about and hold to be true. Attentiveness to where I get my information, to the sources of that information in this era of misinformation. This is a critical aspect of intellectual humility. And then lastly, this acknowledgement that I need to connect to others. And specifically at the very end, I want to relate that to caregivers and patients and clients and the like in particular. So often intellectual humility is traced back to Aristotle's thinking about what he called the golden mean. You might even think about the sort of saying of all things in moderation, this idea that there's kind of a sweet spot between extremes that is adaptive and potentially the high road as far as engaging with the world. So on this continuum, we have on one end intellectual servility, that is feeling as if I know nothing, and I'm completely reliant on others to tell me what to believe and how to believe. And on the far right, thinking essentially I know everything, that therefore I'm unwilling to even consider the possibility I could have it wrong and could in fact learn from others. So this golden mean then situates between these two things, and that's where we put intellectual humility. So not thinking, back to the sort of diagram I showed you, not thinking less, but not thinking more than what in fact I can know. Again, accepting the limits of my knowledge and considering new information as I receive it. Lots of other characteristics of intellectual engagement we could put here. I'll just note that the philosophers in particular are keen on arguing that being intellectually humble doesn't mean I don't have a backbone, and I don't feel conviction, that I don't have courage to stand up for what I believe to be true. And in fact, part of dealing with how we define the concept is how do we have a definition that doesn't make that assumption that people who are highly intellectually humble are somehow unwilling to be courageous and stand up for what they believe. So intellectual timidity is how they would then put that sort of line between servility and humility. It's a crowded conceptual field in our discipline, and in particular, personality and social psychology, where I operate, is often accused of reinventing the wheel, the jingle jangle fallacy, all these issues having to do with the kind of need for novelty and relabeling things. So we were very attentive to what we think intellectual humility is and is not as it relates to well-established constructs in the field. Two of those that we attended to particularly were open-mindedness on the one hand, and dogmatism, and particularly low dogmatism on the other. And what I'm showing here is essentially our argument that intellectual humility shares some features with these constructs, but it differs in important ways. In particular, this willingness to admit my limitations and the willingness to change or update my knowledge as necessary is not part of these older constructs. Sometimes it's located within the conceptual space of what broadly is referred to as wise thinking. Igor Grossman, very productive, talented social psychologist, has written a lot about this idea of wisdom, and you can see that within this space of what he calls wise thinking is intellectual humility. You may recognize this famous curve, the Dunning-Kruger curve, and it's kind of interesting to think about intellectual humility in this space. In particular, it's interesting because on the left, the peak of Mount Stupid is called in this particular graphic. You can see this is a situation in which somebody knows nothing and they're highly confident in what they know. Or they don't know what they don't know, right? And intellectual humility then sort of cross-cuts that diagram in this way. And you can see then on the lower left of that diagram where the sort of accuracy line is I don't know anything and I don't think I know it. But on the upper end, and importantly, intellectual humility allows for the possibility that I know a lot and I'm confident that I know a lot. In other words, I don't discredit the fact that I may have expertise that allows me to make significant claims about what I know. This is a quote that I quite like, in particular as it relates to that upper end of that continuum. I know a lot, and therefore I'm confident in what I know. The argument here is that having a strong opinion is not a bad thing, but even at the same time as I have a strong opinion, I should be willing to consider the possibility that I could have it wrong. In other words, I test myself to be sure that I don't have a blind spot, that I haven't missed something, that new information hasn't emerged that wasn't there before. Let me give an example. This is probably the most prototypic example you could ever see of intellectual humility on display. This is a prominent legal scholar who initially argued that Donald Trump shouldn't be allowed to be on the ballot in the 2024 election. His interpretation of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution ruled that out. He wrote a number of arguments, particularly in high-level places like New York Times. And this is essentially his argument: Trump is ineligible to be on the ballot. Then later, he completely about-faced, and he wrote, Donald Trump is eligible to be on the ballot, and he attributes this seeming flip-flop, we might say in the political realm, to having read some work by two scholars who are people who are highly credible sources who proposed an interpretation, a set of arguments about the 14th Amendment that he found persuasive. And because of that, he changed his view. All right, so with that as kind of background, once we sort of had settled on a definition of this construct, our question was, how do we measure it? There are many, many ways you can measure things. Self-report is where we started. There are other approaches to measurement we can maybe talk about later. We felt like what we wanted was a concise measure. In particular, we wanted something that could be inserted in longer surveys. If we want to understand political preferences, for example, that we could take a survey and slip this in, and then it could be associated with political attitudes and preferences and the like. So these are the 6 items we came up with. There now, by the way, are many measures of intellectual humility, not just ours. This was the first, but there are others. So part of what we tried to do as what I believe to be good scientists is to accept the conceptualization that we put forward and make sure that we have a measure that, as best possible, perfectly maps onto that conceptual definition, so that when we get scores and it's time to interpret them, we can refer back to the conceptualization. And so doing so, you can see here, I'm highlighting how these different items try to do that. And the idea is that metacognitively, so this, by the way, is a definition of intellectual humility that's very much in the head. Metacognitively, I am reflecting, questioning my own views, changing as necessary. So once we had this measure, then the question is, well, can we make the case that this is something new that warrants consideration as its own construct separate from other things? And as we often do, we examine convergent and discriminant validity. That is it like things that it should be like? Is it different from things that should be different from? These are things we thought it should be like. In fact, we would worry if any of these correlations were very, very low. And it turns out they're enough to make us feel comfortable that we're in the right ballpark, but they're not too high. In fact, it may surprise some people. In fact, this one I find particularly interesting because it's of the big 5, if you know the personality domains, this is the only one of the big 5 that it has any kind of appreciable correlation with. In terms of discriminant validity, one always, and so, in fact, I should note, back in the early days of trying to measure humility proper, there was this conundrum that humble people aren't likely to admit that they're humble. And how do you detect it? And people who are not, because it's a socially desirable characteristic, might in fact claim it when it isn't true. So there was reason to worry about social desirability, but you can see here, and this has been repeated across many samples, we don't see any correlation. Dogmatism, remember, we believe there was some shared features, but we didn't want to overdo it. I'll just note that high correlation with the Altmaier scale is because 4 of the items read like intellectual humility items. So that minus 0.2 is probably a better estimate. Intolerance of ambiguity, we expect it to be there. We didn't want it to be too high, and no correlation with self-esteem. In a more recent sample, we correlated it with a number of additional scales, and here are the coefficients just to walk you through a few. So we measured general IH using the scale I showed you. Then we measured a number of other characteristics using the best measures available for them. You can see that in terms of correlations with humility proper, it's clearly a different thing, that it reflects some features of humility in the broad sense, but intellectual humility, as we defined it here, is not one and the same. Open-mindedness, I'll note here there's open-mindedness, and then there's what these days is often referred to as actively open-minded thinking. And in fact, that's what this measures, and that's a pretty typical operational definition these days. And the minute even that label begins to feel a little bit like intellectual humility. So it's not surprising in a way this correlation is higher maybe than we would ideally have liked to have seen. Virtually no relationship to gender. Don't know if that surprises you. There are people who imagine it might be. Come on, tell you what the hypothesis typically is, you probably can guess. And I'll show you some more data in just a moment that underscores that. One of the more interesting ones, and the one that we play a lot with, is this question of, are people on the political left or political right more or less humble than one another? I'll note that this has changed over the 10 years or so since we've been studying it. I think early on, we tended not to find much correlation. I think as years have gone by, we found a little bit of correlation reflected here. That is, people on the political left score higher on intellectual humility than people on the political right. That's not a strong effect, but nonetheless, it's there. Here are some data, again, trying to get a sense of what it is and isn't, and maybe dash some assumptions about that. These are data from about 700 parents of children who were in a study that we were running at the time, and we inserted these measures. You can see, starting top left and working our way around, you can see in this sample, no correlation at all with age. Might surprise you. You might think people would become more intellectually humble over time. I don't know, but no correlation there. Modest correlation with years of education. Right? It's there, but it's not strong. Modest correlation with socioeconomic status as measured by household income. No relationship as measured by the MacArthur ladder, which is the perceived socioeconomic status on the lower right. Here's another data set with gender. Here, I don't have the R, but you can see that the T is non-significant. No difference there. Race, ethnicity, no difference in this sample. Again, that political party affiliation, you can see across on the lower left, the four designations that essentially people affiliated with the Republican Party score somewhat lower. And we even had census data and about who people voted for during the election. No correlation between people who live in counties that went for Trump versus counties that did not. So we're feeling pretty good about having developed a conceptualization and a way to measure it that isn't rehashing or warming over something we already know a lot about. So then the question becomes, well, generally, what, as a construct, what are its sort of defining features? And I think one of those for us has been how trait-like is it? That is, if somebody is high or low in intellectual humility, is it like part of their personality? And the implications of that are, of course, if we want to change it, changing a trait is a different animal than, for example, changing a mindset. Right. So we have a little bit of data. This is a study of, this was a class of Duke students who entered in 2014. We worked with university administration so that we had access to them from day one. And we followed them all the way till they left 4 years later. And we collected data, as you can see, twice a year, each year across those 4 years. And on a few of the assessments, in particular, the first one and the last one, we inserted our intellectual humility measure. And the question would be, do people's levels on intellectual humility change over the course of 4 years in a high-level academic environment? Or anybody have a hypothesis about that? I mean, you would imagine
going both ways, actually. I could see like someone being very confident at the end of their college career about like getting any job experience. They've finished all the classes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But also, like, you hope that they learn about that they actually don't know everything.
Yeah, well, that was our hypothesis, right? That things you thought were true, you're learning aren't true. Things you didn't even know existed, you're learning about them. So this idea of realizing their limits to your knowledge should be salient and evident to you, and should lead to change. And I will say, some people have noted maybe we would have detected that increase in the middle. Then, like you say, by the end, now they're confident. They've aced their courses, they're ready to graduate. So now they have very few limitations because they've got it mastered. Well, here's what we find, actually. It's kind of interesting. This is the reliable change index of looking at the difference between their score as an entering student and as an exiting student 4 years later. You can see 75% or so do not change. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, actually. And in fact, in this data set, we have measures of the Big Five, for example, and the stability is very comparable to personality traits. So in this sample, using our measure, and in this context, there's relatively little change. And when there is, it's very little, but it's on both sides. Some become more, some become less. We probed this a little bit. I can tell you, we had a notion, maybe, for example, philosophy majors would become less intellectually humble, and certain other majors would become more, but none of that really seemed to matter, at least in this sample. So thinking about it, at least as measured in this way as a trait, leads to the question of, for us anyway, well, what are these people like? And a lot of words here. Let me quickly just walk you through some of what we've found. We've taken people who have different religious beliefs, and we've confronted them with contrary beliefs, and we've asked how they react to it. What we found is that people who are higher in intellectual humility are more charitable to the writer of the essay. They rated other positions, religious positions, more positively. We had this question of whether it's possible ever for a politician to change positions without essentially losing their office. In other words, back to the legal scholar, that person clearly did an about face, but in that profession, it's probably not the death knell. But for a politician, it could be, in that the derogatory term is often used, flip-flopping, for that. And we found highly intellectually humble Republicans were more likely to rate a candidate who seemed to flip-flop in positive terms. Moving more cognitively, we find that people high in IH generally are more attentive to strong arguments. If you know the attitude and persuasion literature, strong versus weak arguments, they're more attentive to strong arguments and generally argue that their view is supported by those arguments. We have looked a little bit at the sort of cognitive underpinnings of this. This is one of many studies that these days within this literature broadly falls under the belief updating heading. And the idea is that the question is, what do people do when they learn they're wrong? Do they even recognize that they're wrong? And if they are, do they update? Do they change what they hold to be true? This was an early study, one of our earliest. And we find that when people are given a set of positions and asked to read through them, then they're given a set again with now some other things folded in. They're more readily able to recognize what was in and what was not. They're less likely to overclaim. They know things. There's this really cool and interesting overclaiming scale that has in it certain outrageous facts that aren't true. And the question is, will people claim to have known that? If you can't know it because it wasn't true, and people low in intellectual humility are much more likely to overclaim in this way, that they knew something that is in fact not something to be known. Like so many of us, we were in the field doing work when COVID hit, changed how we do things in a lot of ways. But one thing it changed, I think, to our advantage is, and I thank our IRB for this, we were able to very quickly process new measures and insert them into ongoing studies. And in addition to what we were otherwise studying, also collect relevant data. This is a study of, again, those parents that I showed you earlier. And we were interested in their engagement in recommendations around protection of themselves and other people. In particular, we were interested in wearing face coverings, which had become, by the point of this study, very politicized, polarizing in all sorts of ways, but nonetheless recommended. We did find a relationship between intellectual humility and people's willingness to wear face covering around other people. And for us, then the question became, well, Why are they more willing to do that? And you can think of a variety of reasons that might be true. One of them is a pure knowledge idea, that they somehow have read the research and they're convinced that the research indicates that wearing one protects them and other people. We measured a whole bunch of beliefs about mask wearing in the study. This is them in the middle here, all the different reasons people might think you might wear a mask. It's a complicated figure, so to simplify it, these are the two mediational paths that survived. And what we found interesting about this was that one on the bottom is in fact the knowledge one, right? They become convinced that it's effective, that wearing one will protect themselves and other people. But the upper one is a much more of a kind of a communal one, caring for other people. And this is a relationship. We probed this a little bit in a second study, and there are an interesting set of correlations between intellectual humility and this sort of care concern for other people, which isn't inherent to the definition, and it raises its own questions about why that is true, right? But nonetheless, it is there. So this all relates to general intellectual humility. Much of our work has been focused more on what I'll call specific intellectual humility. And essentially what we've argued here is that almost like any trait, we can think about it in the broadest terms, that is cross-situationally, cross-temporally, and we ask it in that way. We ask people typically or most of the time or usually what you do, or we can think about it in more specific ways. Lots of domain-specific measures, for example. We have a rather elaborate take on how intellectual humility can be viewed in this way. And just to quickly sort of walk you through it, one level down are what we call domains. In other words, I can ask, how intellectually humble are you in the politics domain? How intellectually humble are you in the health domain? And the question, of course, is, are those just a reflection of general, and therefore there's nothing to be gained by splitting the hair? Or is it possible that people may be intellectually humble in one domain and less so in another? You can go down a level further and you come to what we call topics. And the idea is that within any domain, there are a set of topics. It's easy to think about this in the political domain. There's immigration, there's abortion, there's tariffs, all sorts of topics that one might ask about. And the question is there any evidence that intellectual humility varies across topics so that I feel it more or less for some topics than others? I'll just note here, you maybe can't quite see the shaded lines, but that some topics fall under multiple domains, right? For example, abortion might fall under health, might fall under religion, it might fall under politics. So some of these topics are quite complicated in that way. And then lastly, there's specific issues. So for instance, within immigration, we might refer to building a wall along the southern border, or any number of other specific issues that relate to immigration. So we have developed a framework within which we study specific intellectual humility, and just sort of to get to the bottom line, we find substantial variability in intellectual humility across topics and issues, such that it's very clear just measuring general isn't a way to truly get at the role of intellectual humility in people's decision making. And it's also our belief that intervention-wise, this is the place to go. You know, changing a person's personality, I mean, what's the likelihood you're going to do that in any kind of enduring way? But changing how they hold their view about immigration, that seems more feasible. And maybe even more so if it's about, say, building a wall or some other aspect in there. So here's our kind of heuristic for how we think about IH sub S, which is specific IH. That is some part general. We don't believe general is not relevant, but it's not the whole story. That is some part the view they hold. And I'll say more about that in a moment. It turns out this has been the most fruitful piece of the equation for us, the characteristics of the view they hold. And then the qualities of those views. How do they come to hold that view? What psychological function does that view hold for them? And we study this. We developed a measure for this as well. We have a longer scale. We almost always use the abbreviated version, which uses these three items along the bottom. And the way this scale works is you essentially have a phrase. For example, imagine we're interested in the issue of building a wall along the border. We might say, my views about building a border wall today may someday turn out to be wrong, right? And we can essentially insert whatever issue we might be interested in that way. In the very, very first study we published in this line of work, we were focused on the religion domain, and I only show you this to emphasize this notion of it. Sometimes it's about the view that I hold that is critical to how much humility I hold it with. So at this point in time, we had an ad hoc measure. We hadn't even developed our measure yet, but in particular, one aspect of that ad hoc measure is the one that you see depicted in the upper left there. The point I want to make is that we've essentially tried to predict intellectual humility on the y-axis from people's position, their religious views along the x-axis. That runs from not religious at all, sort of anti-religious, and I'll say something about that in a moment, to very pro-religious. You can see first we projected a line through these to show that if you only thought about the linear relationship between those two things, you would conclude that, well, there's a little bit of a relationship, but unless I've got a lot of power, it's not even likely to be significant. You can see on the lower right, for that dimension, it's dead flat. So from a linear perspective, there's very little to weak relationship between these. If you, however, examine the quadratic effect, now what you see is a very clear pattern in which extremity of view is the key feature. So people on either extreme, and note that neither extreme has a corner on the market, right? That people on whatever the issue might be, if it's political left or right, seem equally low in intellectual humility with respect to the issue, in this case, the religion domain. And that gets even to have a little bit of that feel of the golden mean that Aristotle talked about. And it led us to basically what has been the guiding hypothesis that we now have found support for with dozens and dozens of issues. Almost any issue in the political realm you can imagine, and I'll show you some in just a moment. We found that people who are at the extremes are people who are less willing to admit they might have it wrong, less likely to consider alternative views. And I'll just mention here, maybe it seems obvious, but just to be clear, we've worked mostly in the political realm because that's what Templeton would like us to do. But any issue can be plugged in here related to the healthcare professions, healthcare education, all these things could work just fine. Let me give you an example. Among the issues that are at this time, and I think maybe it's still true in some regards, certainly for immigration, facing the U.S., according to U.S. voters, are abortion and immigration. And interestingly, not surprisingly, the electorate has become more polarized over time. And you can see that it's particularly strong, really is equally strong in both cases. High polarization, people at both extremes. So we've done measurements now, multiple measurements in multiple samples of immigration and abortion, people's intellectual humility with reference to those characteristics or those qualities, and where they stand on them. Here are the curves from one data set. What's interesting about these curves, by the way, is they show a little bit of that left-right difference I showed you earlier, with there being a bit more humility on the political left than on the political right. So in other words, these aren't symmetric curves. So these are people's favorability toward immigration, and you can see that on the unfavorable side, which generally would be the political right, that there's very low intellectual humility. These are estimated curves. The scale runs from 0 to 5, and you can see that they have virtually no humility. A little bit more on the right. Their favorability toward the right to abortion is a little misleading, and I'll show you some data here that kind of fleshes it out. Reflecting the polarization that we know exists, for each of these political issues, there were a handful of people who scored the absolute bottom score you can possibly get on intellectual humility. That is, they had zero belief they could have it wrong, zero belief that they would ever change, and zero belief they might learn something new that could discredit what they. So these are bar graphs of just the people who scored zero, and that ran again from 0 to 5 on intellectual humility. You can see on immigration a slight tendency toward about 9% of women, 9% of men. But the startling one here is the abortion one. Just people who scored zero in intellectual humility. A full 41% of women had zero intellectual humility as it relates to abortion. And interestingly, they're divided on the left and on the right, against it and for it. So very strong sort of evidence of it. And men divide out, fewer men scored that zero on abortion, but there were a quarter of them about, and they too were divided on the left and the right. So clear evidence that this kind of extremity is associated with intellectual humility. Well, let me walk you through quickly a table here. There's a lot of information, but seeing it all at once is useful in terms of thinking about how we might understand what specific intellectual humility is. And I'll refer back to this equation that I gave you. So we tried to study all these things and to bring them to bear on our understanding of it. So for 4 specific issues, gun control policy, abortion rights, immigration policy, and we happen to be in the field when executive orders were being thrown around left and right. This is the formal term for executive orders. So we even asked people about their position on executive orders and how humble or not they were about it. So we first have how correlated, if at all, is general intellectual humility with their specific humility. Then how does their view relate to specific intellectual humility? Then what are certain qualities of intellectual humility that may affect their specific intellectual humility? The multiple correlations are pretty impressive. We don't account for all the variance, but we get a lot of it with this set of things. So quickly, sort of walking you through it, reflecting what I think I showed you earlier. Certainly general intellectual humility is correlated with specific intellectual humility, but not highly. In other words, if you only measure general intellectual humility, you would miss some of the impact of the construct on people's behavior. This is probably my favorite piece of the table. So this is showing you, thinking back to that religious beliefs graph I showed you, correlation between people's view, either the linear or the quadratic, and the degree of intellectual humility they have on each. And you can see that linear is in 2 cases non-significant. And in the other 2, fairly modest, a little more so for executive orders. But you can see that the quadratic effect is pretty robust, and particularly so for the 2 issues I showed you earlier. So in our sort of emerging kind of theory of specific intellectual humility, this idea of extremity turns out to be very central. Then we measured a set of qualities that we thought might matter. I'll run through these pretty quickly. We thought that people who were higher on intellectual humility might be more inclined to go against the views, if they thought they were correct, of the people around them. So this is for those of you who know classic social psych, this is a measure of consensus from the old false consensus literature. We asked them, what proportion of people of different types share your view? They think about this the same way you do. And these were social media people, real life friends, and family. We expected negative correlations, and you can see that we get them. They're not strong, but they're always there. So the higher people are on intellectual humility, the less likely they are to claim consensus with others around them. What about emotions? We ask a bit about that. People are more curious, intellectually humble people are more curious, less concerned about alternative views, less indifferent about them, less disappointed by them. These, by the way, again, are views related to these four things across the top. An interesting feature that we've spent a fair bit of time with, originally thought it was going to be the key, it hasn't turned out to be as central as we had hoped, is how attached are people to their views? And there's a whole literature of Buddhist, Zen Buddhist literature about attachment and cultivating detachment. And I'll say something about that in a moment. But we expected people high in intellectual humility to be less attached to their views. And you could see, though the effects are not strong, and in a couple of cases they're not there, they're always negative. How would they react if they learned that they were wrong? Again, we expected positive correlations around some willingness to change their views, either overtly or internally, and less of a likelihood to hold on to their current. And then we thought one challenge and one aspect of views that may make them particularly tough to change is they may serve certain functions. And for here, psychological functions. And for here, we went to the attitudes literature. And we generally find that they're less likely to, and I'll say more to flesh this out in just a moment, they're less likely to hold a view for functional reasons, which means that letting go of it or changing it, the psychological consequences of doing so are less. And then increasingly, we've been interested in how morality plays into all this. And we expected and we find that people who are high in intellectual humility are less likely to associate their views with moral stands. So just to summarize that, the more extreme the view, the less humility they hold it with. It's evident on both sides, and it's associated with these things I just showed you. And let me be clear, what I just showed you is the correlation between those characteristics and specific intellectual humility. They're all, those same things are associated with extremity, which is what I'm showing you here. All right, sort of to wind up and lead us toward thinking more application-wise about it. So I've shown you the dimension of general to specific and the different levels at which one might consider that. We also might think about intellectual humility in the moment versus intellectual humility across time in a typically stable way. We've increasingly, and I think people in the field have increasingly been asking, is it possible to get better leverage in terms of thinking about intellectual humility in a now? If I'm in a meeting with people and I need people to be willing to consider a variety of positions, potentially changing their position, all I really care about is right now, can I get people to a place where they're willing to do that? So there's been a strong bias in the field toward this domain general, temporally stable, but gradually the field is moving toward these others. And just to sort of think a little bit about the state idea, there is a way of thinking about traits illustrated here with density distributions. That is, a person has a particular standing on a trait, but they don't always behave precisely as that standing would dictate. A person who's moderately extroverted sometimes is quite extroverted. Sometimes they're introverted, right? And so what you get, if you could sample them across many, many, many points, across many, many situations, what you would find is a distribution that looks sort of like this, that has at its center sort of where they would stand on a trait, which, by the way, means we miss a whole lot of rich and interesting variability by just giving a person a scale one time and asking them what they usually do and how they do it. So as they move away from that, those reflect what we'll call states. And so part of the question for me in terms of intervening is, how do we take people at their trait level and at least in some way move them in the moment, one way or the other on the trait, in this case, mostly toward greater intellectual humility. The idea being, and one thing about these distributions is we know people tend to revert back. So a state, a particular context takes them to a place that's different from their trait. They behave that way for a little while, but then pretty soon they rebound to the trait. So why might we want then to cultivate intellectual humility? Lots of reasons. These are all empirically supported. They all come from what now is a pretty substantial literature. And these are characteristics that play well across many contexts, including the educational context. Been a little bit of work on intellectual humility in the medical practice and the medical education context. Just flashing a couple of ideas here by you. In the education context, in particular, the question is it worth considering that in educating healthcare providers, part of that education needs to be the cultivation of humility, and particularly focusing on this article, which I would highly recommend to you. There's a podcast, which I've referenced here, that was funded by Templeton as part of a media infusion of funding to media to promote intellectual humility. And the authors of that paper talk about their findings. And in particular, they talk about the fact that they simply asked people, what do you think makes an excellent doctor? These were practicing physicians. In other words, they didn't ask specifically about humility. But what they suggest is they found a lot of evidence of humility in people's descriptions of what makes an excellent article. And these are actual quotes from the podcast. And you can see they just map exceedingly well onto the construct as we have defined it. I think particularly that second quote, being confident enough to know when you don't know. It's kind of an interesting, you would think knowing that you don't know would suggest low confidence. But their argument is no, it takes a certain amount of confidence to be able to do that. So they see that as kind of the inward looking part, and then the outward looking part is this idea of appreciating that excellent care requires listening to the patient, listening to other team members of various sorts, which is itself an indication that I don't know everything. There are other people who know things I don't know. It's together that we reach the best outcome. I want to briefly say a word about this related concept that we've been working with, which we call intellectual hospitality. And if you go back in the literature, there's a fair bit conceptually written about how do you create hospitable environments for disagreement in the classroom. This particular paper is referring to the academy as the university writ large. And the argument is, well, let me tell you what we mean by hospitality. So just as we did with intellectual humility, we've tried to define intellectual hospitality in a very specific operational way. And we view it as respectful interest in others' beliefs. And this is the key part, regardless of whether their beliefs differ from my own beliefs. In fact, most of our measurement of it is specifically saying, when I don't agree with them, how do I approach, how do I understand what they have to say and even allow it without judgment or argument against it. All right, so several ideas about how we might change it, and then two examples of having done so to some degree. I'll just note that probably our best efforts would focus on temporary and situated views. That is, at this point in time, this particular view, how do we get people to come at it in a more intellectually humble way? In so doing, we highlight that a lot of perfectly reasonable people have different views about things, right? So that lower consensus idea We lower the cost of reconsidering reviews, reduce attachment. And I always have liked this quote by Adam Grant. It's from this book, which I would highly recommend to you. He says, your ideas are not your identity. And that was that attachment idea that we were talking about, this idea. If you become very attached to a view, a position, that anything that threatens that position threatens you. And his argument is, well, it's not about, these are just ideas. They're just positions that people take that probably are wrong, almost all of them. And we can talk about them without it being personal. All right, two quick examples. The Constructive Dialogue Institute has a program called Perspectives that people can go through online, 8 weeks. One of the modules, just showing you here, is in fact specifically on intellectual humility. They did an RCT of this program, 8 weeks, waitlist control. So the treatment group got it for 8 weeks. Then they ceased to get it. Control group didn't get it the first 8 weeks. Then they got it the second 8 weeks. And the results were pretty promising. They studied 3 things: affective polarization, intellectual humility, conflict. Didn't get anything for conflict resolution skills. But what these graphs are basically showing is that on the right is affective polarization, and you can see the overall reduction. On the left is intellectual humility, and you can see the light blue line increases in the first 8 weeks, levels off. That's the treatment group. It's basically level in the first week, but it goes up the second 8 weeks. That's the waitlist control. So pretty persuasive evidence. And this is using our general intellectual humility scale as a dependent variable. Last one, we have a study, just got the data in last Tuesday. So fresh data, I analyzed it last night. I know how it is, you want to see data quickly. We've been interested in the idea of explaining your position as a potential way to cultivate intellectual humility. There was a paper we had become aware of that showed that explaining your position leads to more open-mindedness, but it didn't seem to lead to more intellectual humility. We felt like just asking people to explain their position, I mean, it could go the other way, right? If I explain my position to you, I could come away even more strongly believing my position is the right one. So we felt like that study didn't really get at what intellectual humility is about. As part of an undergraduate's work for a certificate, we needed it to be a child and family issue. So cell phone use in the school by kids became our issue. So we had 3 conditions here, and so there's the basic explain your position that these earlier researchers use. We didn't expect any effect here. Second explanation, by the way, these are situations in which people completed some measures. We audio recorded. We asked them to record a 2 to 2.5 minute audio recording explaining yourself to another person. We have the transcriptions of those. Then why your position could be challenged and why the other position has merit. It's that third one that we thought would be the one that would cultivate some specific intellectual humility. The effects are small. I didn't tinker with the y-axis. It's the full breadth of the measure, which is why these look so tiny. But you can see the time by condition effect is significant, and the comparison that reaches significance is for that why, explaining why other positions on, in this case, cell phone use in schools could have merit. Note, interestingly, just explaining yourself there on the left, see, it's not quite significant, but it does lead to just seemingly a little reduction. Okay, so I will stop there and credit the funder and the people who worked with me and happily have a discussion.
All right, so I will. All right, so if folks behind me have questions, tell me. But in the chat, we have a couple already. So the first from Tabitha, I think is sort of a methodological question. What level of neutrality, so this is going back to the piece around immigration, what level of neutrality was presented to individuals when getting their views on this topic? So For example, was your question phrased as, what are your views on a wall being built? Versus, do you think a wall should be built? Versus, how strongly do you agree or disagree that a wall should be
Yeah.
built?
That's a good question. It reminds me of a point I was going to make earlier. I think some of the literature on intellectual humility misses the extremity angle because they don't use a bipolar measure, right? For example, I could ask about religious beliefs and I could ask, do you believe God exists? Not at all to very much, right? That's a unipolar scale, right? The lower pole of that is not the opposite of that. And if you only use that scale, you would probably get, if anything at all, you might get a slight downward linear relationship. So we very much, anytime we do this kind of work, we're always keen on equally representing the two extremes. When we can, interestingly, and my philosophy is in research, don't reinvent the wheel. If somebody's done it, we go to Pew, which measures this kind of stuff all the time. And it's pretty easy for these issues in particular to find descriptive phrases that equivalently represent one extreme versus the other. So we literally put those on the two ends. And we often have it range from -2 to +2. So there's a 0 in the middle. So we try not to in any way favor one over the other.
And some folks have put more than one question. I am grateful for that. And we've got 50 people online. And so if you have more than one question, I'll circle back to you once we get through everybody's ones. So next we have Nathan, who says, how do you account for religious folks who are very unlikely to change their views because they do not trust their own ability to discern truth or false or right from wrong, and thus rely on religious texts? Some religious practices discourage any questioning. Could you classify them as intellectually humble but unlikely to change their views?
Oh, interesting. I'm not sure I can unpack all that. I mean, I think religion, we, by the way, have steered clear, except for that first study, we've stayed within the political domain because it gets really complicated. And Scotty, by the way, even more, just to digress a moment, I mean, Christian nationalism has become a major force in our country, and that's within the political realm, but it has a lot of religious stuff attached to it, a lot of it not genuine, to be honest. And so putting all that aside, I think one question for me in all this is, how do you think about religious faith? Right. And in fact, the argument is that most matters of religious belief are matters of faith, which means that I have no unequivocal evidence that I could necessarily present to a non-believing person that would make it clear why I believe what I believe to be true. I simply take it as an article of faith. To me, that almost necessitates intellectual humility, right? That, well, I can't tell you for sure, but I believe it firmly. It's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's a complicated one to unpack. By the way, I'll say interesting, by the way, too, in this, a handful of the scholars funded by Templeton are people who grew up religious and have become disenfranchised from current former religious settings. So they bring to the understanding of humility and intellectual humility this questions like this one. How do you deal with people's unwillingness to admit they could have it wrong, or there could be a different perspective that, and there's no way to choose between the two.
Nathan is still online, so he'll follow up if he wants.
I got one in the room. If
We have someone in the room. Okay.
I had a related question to that one. I'm actually reading a really fascinating book right now about the development of faith identities. And one of the sort of markers between two of the stages that people may or may not progress between is the sort of, I guess, tacit understanding or tacit agreement with what the community says is true or is the way to think about things. And so tacit meaning unquestioned, because it's just the way that things are. And so the question that I had written down about the data that you shared was, have you asked a question about, or is it sort of a moderating variable, strength, and not religiously, but just any sort of strength of identity with a group that a person may be influenced by. So like, I'm a really strong, union member in my job. I'm a really strong member of a faith community. I'm a really strong adherent believer with a particular advocacy organization. So is that sort of strength of belief within a group that sort of has a set of identity characteristics that you might want to really strongly adhere to be a member of that group? Does that influence intellectual?
Yeah, I don't know that we measured anything along those lines. Funny, I'm working on a paper right now, a review paper of all of our work, and I have a whole little section in the beginning. There's some very old literature on what's called consensual validation. The person that I think of most when I think of is a guy named Don Byrne, and he wrote that we are attracted to people who share our attitudes. And his argument was, to some degree, is because we need consensual validation for things that we can never know objectively if they're true or false. And one way we get that is we look to the people around us, and by consensus, we all come to the agreement that this is how it is. So I think that happens a lot, and I think almost by necessity. I think there is, though, if you think back to that graph I originally had in the servility end of that graph, some of what you initially started describing sounded very much like servility. I sort of outsource knowledge and understanding to this third party, and I never personally engage with the complexities of it or the challenges of supporting it.
A question about perception of cultural humility, like our own cultural humility, and the actual results. I can imagine someone might perceive themselves as very very intellectually humble, and actually not demonstrate that in their actions.
Yeah.
So when you're getting at self-report, people are reporting
Yeah.
that, and then how do we sort of verify that?
That's a fair question that probably the whole literature has to grapple with. And I do think, maybe you have this experience, I certainly do, where I act out of character in certain settings where the social pressure is such that it causes me to. So I think that intellectual humility, the way we conceptualize, is very much internal, but it's always bumping up against what's true, externally. But I think the lack of cultural humility is a major issue in our country right now. Right. And how to think about that, and whether that's a piece of whether intellectual humility has anything to offer there, whether that's its own thing is a different. But I do think the people who study it tend to think of it's its own thing, and warrants its own study. It may or may not, follow some of these same principles I just showed. But this idea that what I say on a questionnaire and what I do in real interaction may not be one and the same. We've tried a little bit, by the way. We're about to field an EMA, ecological momentary assessment study. And in some ways, that's what that's supposed to do, get you a little closer to them reporting in the moment when they're actually doing it. Right. So they don't get the opportunity to step away. So we'll see if that shows us anything different.
I have one other question. You mentioned that you were going to talk about
Oh,
sorry.
You get one question.
Okay. the downsides of intellectual humility. And that.
Yeah. I think it may be, ironically, thinking of the golden mean idea that having too much is a bad thing. In fact, we have some old data in which we correlated intellectual humility with a bunch of self-related variables, and self-concept clarity was one of them. It's kind of an interesting concept, this idea that people vary in how clear they are about their own sort of sense of self. People high in intellectual humility score lower. They have a less clear sense of themselves. And our argument was, well, like everything else, they're holding out that they could not quite have it figured out yet, and they need to learn more. So we tend to bias a little bit the literature. I don't know if we study enough, but I think probably we're going to discover more and more that it's not the magic bullet for everything.
So maybe related to that, Sabina is starting with some humility, so please correct her if she's wrong. But it seems that intellectual humility is negatively correlated with strong concerns about the opposing point of view. When the stakes are high, people tend to quote unquote dig in and defend their position. How then can we argue that intellectual humility is still beneficial? Is it adaptive in such situations?
So the more, yeah, I see her point. The more intellectually humble I am, the less concerned I am when confronted with an alternative view. And that may disincline me to attend to that view. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. It makes me think I need to be more careful in interpreting what that sign means. Because I think we had the sort of view that, being confronted with alternative views could be unsettling. It could concern me but if I'm intellectually humble, that should be less likely to be true. But on the other hand, it may suggest a lower likelihood of engagement.
This might be maybe a little bit related to Tim's question, but Colleen is wondering, because she's curious, if you know how early caregiving environments may shape or influence the development of intellectual.
Yeah, sadly, we know almost nothing. I think of all the grants Templeton's funded, maybe 3 were to people who work with children. And they really were more about what parents do, the degree to which parents model intellectual humility in the household, but really very little measurement of the children themselves. So, I mean, it'd be interesting to know. I mean, in some ways, if we think about it as a trait, it's hard to believe there's a genetics argument for it. So you got to believe it's socialized. So the question is, how does it get socialized exactly?
And Colleen would specifically like to figure out how child psychologists can help parents.
Yeah.
So Colleen, maybe you want to work with the Templeton Foundation.
I have another one, but I know there's a limit.
Go for it, and I'm gonna go back to the beginning.
Okay. It's actually the other end of Colleen's question. So I noticed that you're talking about application of like how do we cultivate this in the world? And you mentioned the Constructive Dialogue Institute, which it's great to be familiar with that. In Minnesota was the launching pad for a group called Braver Angels, which I don't know if they tap into some of this work.
Yeah,
or
they
not.
do, yeah.
How many other groups are out there doing this kind of dissemination work that you're aware of?
Yeah, I don't know. Those would be 2. Braver Angels is a wonderful group, and they were very much part of it. Interestingly, Templeton originally funded about 20 of us to do the work that kind of launched all this. The second round of funding, they expanded a bit, but it's a pretty tough. There was a period in which I knew everybody on the planet who was studying intellectual humility. And then at some point they became very interested in breaking free of all that. And they ran a competition for established groups to think about dissemination. Braver Angels was one of them. And I think they would even say, they mean it differently, but constructive dialogue is a lot of what they're about. Otherwise, I think it's been more part of that. An effort was people trying to produce media that people would intake, and that somehow that would acquaint them with it, why they should consider it. And I don't know that that's going to be effective, but yeah.
So I'll go back to Tabitha. I believe this question dropped when you had the slide up about pro and con with abortion. And the question was, what trends did you find in the methods through which the different groups had their initial views informed, and or how they might get exposure to other views?
Oh, I don't know if we have data. I don't even know if we have data to help with that. I mean, we could go back to the big table, and one of the columns was for abortion, but I don't know that it was particularly different from any of the others in terms of the different forces. The consensus, for example, I mean, you might believe that it would be particularly prone to believing that everybody around me, family members and close friends, share my view. And therefore, back to that idea of consensual validation, then that allows me to conclude that that it's the right view. Of course, it cuts both ways, and
Sure.
that's the problem.
Sabina had another question since we only got an hour of your time. If there's anything else you would like to elaborate on with how intellectual humility can be taught.
Yeah, here I think I could put on my personality hat, psychologist hat, because I think you could take any desirable trait and ask, if it's a trait, how do you change it? I used to be in the camp that personality just is, it doesn't change. There have been some really nice papers lately. There's even a whole special issue of a journal I'm an associate editor of, American Psychologist, on volitional personality change. It's kind of an interesting term. But broadly, my mind got changed. Brent Roberts and colleagues, Brent's at Illinois, showed that people who had gone through therapy, and in the intake measures of personality had been collected, as is sometimes done, and they were collected at post-test and follow-up down the line. It turned out that there was a fair bit of personality change. And their argument that made it really kind of interesting was the therapies were not oriented toward personality change. They were addressing depression or anxiety or whatever the presenting symptoms might have been. And it was a meta-analysis, a lot of studies. It was pretty hard to argue with. But it didn't leave you with, you can't just take people who need more intellectual humility and put them through therapy just for the purpose of getting them. So I don't know. My view is that general is pretty entrenched, that our best hope is specific, and that some of these mechanisms that we're highlighting are how you get it done. But I think probably Braver Angels is kind of coming around at that way, that the bridges they're trying to create are between people talking about real issues, right? They're not broad, they're specific. And maybe you hope that's going to somehow percolate up to my density distribution. If you get them to move beyond how they usually are, eventually it'll pull that midpoint up the scale, and they'll generally become more intellectually humble.
So Nathan stayed put and was clearly comfortable with your ambiguous response previously, and said, "Thank you, Rick. The concept of belief without hard evidence makes me think of reliance on emotion and intuitive reasoning as opposed to analytical reasoning." Which leads me to wonder about if there is a correlation between intellectual humility and reasoning style. He thinks he saw a correlation with rationality.
Yep, that's the one I would.
Slides.
Yes.
So do you think that relates to reasoning style?
I do. In fact, we have other measures that I'm blanking on now that get at sort of styles, and we always find that correlation. It isn't strong, not necessarily, but it's there.
All right, we do have more than 30 people still online, and you're from a broad swath of the department, so if there's any final questions.
A question or an observation, maybe more than a question, but I'm thinking about the sort of analog to psychotherapy that you touched on, like, can psychotherapy be involved in intellectual humility? I just wonder, from like an intrapersonal perspective, I think about your work in DBT and my work, where we talk about holding two positions and that there's benefit to that, and you kind of have to do that, and then sort of hold your affiliation to those loosely to be able to coexist with them.
Oh, I like that.
And that's something that it's certainly a departure from the concept that you're raising here,
but
interpersonally. But I think we wrestle with this with our patients and with a variety of psychopathologies in the work that we do one-on-one. So I guess it's more of a statement than a question, but
well, no, it's an idea.
Yeah.
I mean, right. I mean, I'm not qualified to implement it, but it'd be fun to collaborate.
I mean, that's, in DBT, we're looking at creating dialectics and acknowledging those dialectics and finding that middle path.
Yeah.
So getting to that, I guess, golden mean, as you say.
Yeah.
That we can find the truth on both
Yeah,
sides and be able to kind of form a new truth out of that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rick. Thank you, everybody.